Hello everyone and welcome to another video. The year is 1986. After spending the past 18 months on a long unprecedented hiatus, Doctor Who finally returns to our screens, with a season-long story arc called The Trial of a Time Lord. Despite the production team's best efforts, the show's ratings have fallen dramatically, and many fans now believe the show has truly lost its way. And they're not the only ones. Michael Graves, the then BBC One controller, is even less satisfied with the show, with him having already been unhappy with the direction it had been taking the previous few years, which is what led him to try and cancel the show back in 1985. In desperation, he writes to one of the show's creators, Sidney Newman, and asks him if he has any ideas with what to do with the show. On the 6th of October 1986, Newman wrote back to Graves to tell him that he did indeed have some ideas. He suggested bringing Patrick Troughton back as the Doctor for a single season, before then having the first ever female Doctor, along with some more street cred companions. Graves suggested that Newman meet with the BBC's then head of drama, Jonathan Powell, to discuss these ideas further. Unfortunately, Sidney Newman and Jonathan Powell didn't get on with each other, and nothing came of the whole thing. The show would instead stagger on in the ratings for a few more years, with Sylvester McCoy's 7th Doctor, before finally being outright cancelled in 1989. But what if things had gone differently? What if, in an alternate timeline, Sidney Newman's ideas had borne fruit? What if Patrick Troughton had returned for season 24. Now obviously we need to address the very big elephant in the room here. Patrick Troughton died in late March 1987, just less than 6 months after Sidney Newman had replied to Michael Graves and explained his ideas to him. So there's no way that even if there'd been a rapid turnover in production, Troughton would have finished filming before he sadly passed away, bearing in mind that it took them about 4 months to actually film our timelines season 24. So in order for this alternate timeline to work, we would need to shift the timing of things to a few months earlier than October 1986. How about the springtime, like May for instance? The only other roadblock standing in the way of this scenario would be how Sidney Newman and Jonathan Powell didn't get on well with each other, but it wouldn't be too difficult to imagine their meeting going a lot better, for the sake of this alternate scenario. So now that that's all sorted, what would happen next? Well, I can imagine John Nathan Turner would probably be informed that his services would no longer be required as the show's producer. Part of Sidney Newman's plans was for him to serve as the show's executive producer, but probably with similar responsibilities as what J&T had as its producer. Whilst J&T would be sad to say goodbye to the show, he would also probably be relieved that he could finally move on to other things. He'd wanted to leave the show around about that time after all. I should mention though that this is all merely my own interpretation of what Sidney meant, so it might not necessarily be right. He might have meant that he takes on a role more akin to what Barry Letts did for season 18, that being more of an overseer rather than a more hands-on approach that a producer would doubtless take. But regardless, I can't really imagine him and J&T working together, as their approaches and visions for the show were just too different to each other, so J&T would probably have left anyway. But anyway, with J&T having handed things over to Sidney Newman, Sidney would then get in touch with Patrick Troughton and ask if he'd be willing to come back for a full season. Troughton would accept, being just too intrigued to see how Sidney's ideas would turn out, to say no. Whether Sidney intended Patrick Troughton to play the second Doctor again is difficult to say, but we'll say that he did for the sake of this video. In terms of how the Doctor would return to this familiar face, there probably would have been some type of regeneration scene at the beginning of the first story. Colin Baker might have still not come back for it, as he might have still been upset with the BBC for firing him, which would probably still happen, unfortunately. He might have even been upset with Sidney Newman wanting to bring Patrick Troughton back rather than continue with him. So Troughton might have just had to do what Sylvester McCoy did in our timeline, that being him donning a blonde wig and wearing Colin's outfit, so as to pretend to be him. Although, who knows, maybe Sidney and Colin could have come to an agreement and he would have filmed the regeneration scene after all. It would certainly work a lot better if Colin was actually there, I think. But what about the companion side of things? Would Bonnie Lamford stay on as Mel? Well, as I alluded to in the intro, Sidney also had his own ideas about the new companions. According to a letter he sent to Grade, he suggested a companion who was a trumpet-playing schoolgirl in John Lennon glasses, as well as her elder brother, a yobo who sprays graffiti everywhere, as a secondary companion. So it sounds like Sidney wanted to do what was essentially done with Ace in our timeline. He wanted a more street cred, potentially relatable companion in the girl's older brother. In terms of who would be cast, well, I'm not too sure actually. I'm not too familiar with 80s British TV, apart from Doctor Who of course, so I'll let those of you who are comment below your own fan casts for these companions. Due to how the mention of these new companions is worded in Sidney's letter, I'm going to go on the assumption that he had intended them to travel with the female Doctor he mentioned, which we'll get to in a bit, don't you worry. So we could just have Mel stick around to travel with Patrick Troughton's Doctor after all. And I think we should have Jamie come back as well, just because I'm sure Troughton would ask Sidney if he could work with his old friend Fraser Hines again. I don't think we would still have the Cal video title sequence. I think there would be an entirely different title sequence instead, which might harken back to the original while still looking like it was made in the 80s, if that makes any sense. It would be essentially a halfway point between those two ideas. And I have to thank Billy Bob for creating this awesome title sequence for this video that represents those ideas really well. And I bet Sidney would change both the TARDIS interior and exterior to resemble the originals more closely. Maybe he would wait until the alternate season 25 to tie in with the new female Doctor, or maybe he would do it as soon as he took over. But anyway, what kind of stories would this alternate season 24 be comprised of? Well, I can't really imagine Sidney wanting to go with any of our timeline's season 24 stories. They just wouldn't fit in with his vision for the show. So they would probably be entirely different types of stories. Stories which might be a bit difficult for us to predict. So what I'm going to do is something that I've never actually done before. I'm going to have to come up with some stories myself. So let's start things off with the first story, which I'm going to call The Castle of Macrimmon. We would start things off with the regeneration scene, of course. This would probably be something similar to the one that was at the start of Time and Arani, but without the Rani herself, obviously. The TARDIS would crash land in 18th century Scotland. The Doctor and Mel would be thrown to the floor, with the Doctor regenerating back into the second Doctor's form. Confused why he's ended up with an old face, the Doctor would stumble outside, only to come face to face with an older Jamie, who had seen the TARDIS crashing through the air and rushed towards the crash site. The Doctor would be delighted to see Jamie again, but Jamie would have no idea who he is. The Doctor is surprised at this, as Jamie should at least remember their first adventure together. Nevertheless, the two of them, along with Mel, would battle against the Yeti and Great Intelligence, who would come back for their promised third fight against the Doctor. So yeah, I've basically taken some plot elements of the Laird of McCrimmon unmade story and combined them with a Time and Nirvana styled opening. Behind the scenes wise, obviously an agreement would have to be reached between the BBC and Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln regarding the rights to the Yeti. I don't know how likely it is they could sort it out in just a few months, but we'll just say that they can come to an agreement for the sake of this story. Perhaps one of the conditions is that Haseman and Lincoln are the ones who write the story. Back to the in-universe stuff, Jamie would ask if he could come with the Doctor and Mel, and they would accept. The Doctor would continue to be wondering about Jamie's memory though. Next up would be a pure historical story. Let's not forget that Sidney Newman was a massive advocate of the pure historicals in the William Hartnell era, due to him wanting the show to educate young viewers as well as entertain them, and I believe he would still feel the same way over 20 years later. In terms of what the story details would be, I'm not too sure, but I could imagine something like the unmade Farewell Great Macedon story by Maurice Fahey. This was an unmade story planned for the very first season back in 1964, but was abandoned when Fahey got fed up of the script being changed too much by David Whittaker, to the extent that he felt like it was losing its historical accuracy. Fahey had tried to resubmit the story when Donald Tosh took over as the story editor, so it's not impossible that he could have resubmitted it again at Sidney's request. If you didn't already know, Farewell Great Macedon would have seen the TARDIS crew meeting Alexander the Great. For the third story of this alternate season 24, I'm going to go with a Dalek story written by their original creator, Terry Nation. Nation and Sidney were friends after all, so I think Sidney would invite him to come back to the show. In terms of the story details, I don't know whether Nation would want to continue where Eric Sayward left off, with the upcoming Dalek Civil War teased in both Resurrection and Revelation of the Daleks. He might want to return the Daleks to basics and do more of his own thing. Sidney might also ask if he could not rely on continuity so much anyway, as the first and final stories would kind of already be pushing the season's accessibility to new viewers to the extreme. Maybe he would have adapted his script for the abandoned Dalek spin-off from the 60s, and removed the references to the Space Security Service so as to not confuse new viewers. Or maybe it would be something very different, perhaps tying into Resurrection and Revelation more anyway. Let's call this story Revenge of the Daleks. Then we get to the final story for the season. For this I'm going to go with a version of the unmade Nightmare Fair story. I know I said that Sidney would probably want to go in a very different way to what J&T did, but I believe it could work pretty well, provided it had a lot of rewrites and restructuring. The Doctor would still have come face to face with the Toymaker and played some video games against him, but there would now be more of a series finale feel to it, akin to the War Games and the Caves of Androzani, as well as most of the new series' final stories for each Doctor, of course. At the end, the Toymaker would leave the Doctor a parting gift. He would reveal that he was the one who caused the Doctor's old face to come back, and manipulated events so that the Doctor and Jamie would be reunited, which would cause Jamie's memories to return and overload his mind, killing him. The Doctor would be outraged by this, but Jamie would ask the Toymaker what memories he was referring to. The Toymaker would grin and snap his fingers, giving Jamie his memories back. As the Toymaker predicted, this ultimately kills Jamie, dying in the Doctor's arms. The Doctor would be devastated and asks the Toymaker why he did all of this. The Toymaker smiles and says simply, "Revenge, Doctor. Why else?" before hitting the Doctor with a lethal energy beam. The Doctor collapses and Mel would rush to his side as the Toymaker vanished, cackling. The Doctor would then regenerate into a new female incarnation. But who would play this female 7th Doctor? Well, Sidney Newman did actually have a few ideas. In his original letter to Michael Grade, he suggested Joanna Lumley, Dawn French and Frances de la Tour. For this alternate timeline, I'm going to go with Joanna Lumley, as I personally believe she would be the best choice, as she already had some experience with science fiction with Sapphire and Steel. And it's not like the idea of her playing the Doctor is anything new, as she obviously played the role briefly in The Curse of Fatal Death. The next season would then start where the previous one left off, with the newly regenerated Doctor and Mel still in Blackpool. The first story would probably deal with introducing the new companions, as well as writing Mel out. After that, who knows? I could go even further with coming up with my own stories, or at the very least, reworking already existing ones. But I already feel like this timeline is too dangerously close to fanfiction. Although if you want me to go further in a future video, please let me know in the comments section below. I'm not sure whether all of this would have prevented the show from being cancelled in 1989, but if it did, I could imagine Lumley staying on for the standard 3 seasons. Whilst I doubt that the McCoy era would still come about in this alternate timeline, it is possible that some of its stories would end up getting made anyway. Maybe ones like Remembrance of the Daleks, perhaps? If the show did still get cancelled in 89, then I can imagine some fans and members of the general public blaming it on the casting of a female Doctor. Let's not forget how controversial Jodie Whittaker's casting was nearly 30 years later after all. I think the revival would still happen with very little changes. Although maybe with a female Doctor having already happened, perhaps it wouldn't be too long until we had another, despite the fan backlash. So yeah, basically, if it did still get cancelled, I can't see that much changing. But if it didn't, then who knows? Maybe Sydney's vision for the show will be enough to ensure it carries on into the 90s and 2000s. It just depends on how it would go down with the viewers. I can imagine Joanna Lumley's time as the Doctor still having the same structure as the McCoy era did for each season, that being 14 25-minute long episodes. This is because this was already something in place for the Trial of a Time Lord season, and I can't imagine Michael Grade and Jonathan Powell wanting to give the show any more episodes for the time being. But perhaps Sidney Newman might be able to eventually convince the high-ups to give the show more episodes after all. As for who would replace Sidney Newman when he eventually left the show, I honestly don't know. This whole scenario has been absolutely fascinating to work on, because of its potential implications. I did have to do what I call the fanfiction approach with this one, as otherwise this video wouldn't have lasted very long. There's very little that we know about what exactly Sidney had planned for the show, beyond the few bits he mentioned in his letter to Michael Grade. I myself am not that keen on the fanfiction approach, but let me know in the comments what you thought of it. I know some of you have been wanting me to do more in-depth what-ifs, as well as have very different actors playing the Doctor, so I'll be interested to know whether you felt like this video pulled both of those off well enough or not. I don't think any of my crazy ideas are even close to what Sidney would have done with the show, but as I say, I had very little to go on, so I had to basically make stuff up in order to flesh this video out. But anyway, so there's my take on what if Patrick Troughton had returned for season 24. But what did you think? Do you like my take on it or not? And would you have done anything differently? Please let me know in the comments section below. Anyway, so thanks for watching, hope you liked it. Please don't forget to press that subscribe button below, as well as press the bell icon at the side of it, so that you'll stay notified of when all my new videos come out. Also, please rate and comment below your thoughts on all of this, and please feel free to donate to my Ko-fi page, link in the description, or send me a YouTube super thanks below, if you want to of course. And I shall see you all in another video. So, until next time, bye bye!